This is your spiritual game plan, and I'm your host, Cheri Fletcher. Change. It happens to all of us. You've invested your time and energy into an important role, sometimes for years. Then suddenly it's time for you to move on. Maybe you've worked hard on a dream, and now your path is taking a new turn, but the dream isn't going with you. Perhaps you've raised your kids, and now they've moved on, but your empty nest is filled with parent care. Maybe you're in the middle of diaper changes and laundry piles. If you find yourself asking questions like, where do I fit in anymore? Am I even relevant? How do I find my purpose now? You are in the right place. This is the show for women in a season of transition. I believe that while your roles in life will change, your purpose is eternal. I'm here to help you understand just how intentionally you were made by a creator with a game plan. Through interviews and inspirational guests, we'll discover ways to help you unlock the purpose God placed in you, develop a game plan for your life's calling, and embrace the intentional masterpiece you were created to be. Today, I'll be talking with Dorina Gilmore Young, a writer, speaker, former news reporter, and longtime runner. Dorina is a glory chaser who meets God running the trails through the mountains or near the ocean. She's passionate about helping people discover God's glory on life's unexpected paths. Whether or not you run, Walk, Run, Soar, the 52-week devotional is designed for those who hope to experience God's presence, purpose, and glory in a deeper way where faith and fitness intersect. Dorina, thank you so much for joining me today, all the way from California. How are you out there today?
I'm in Central California. Thanks for having me, Cheri. And it is a hot day. I am so glad that the listeners and viewers cannot see me sweating.
Did you say it was 105?
Well, actually, today is 100, which is cool for us during this time of year. We've had some 110 days in the last few weeks. It's been pretty wild.
Yeah, when I grew up, I remember one time out where I grew up in California, it was 120, and they were telling us to get our animals inside and get inside, and
oh man,
that's crazy time. Well, I actually was first introduced to your writing because I won a book bundle in a contest on Instagram that Encourage was running, and one of your books was in there, and it was called Flourishing Together, and it had the metaphor of God being a master gardener, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I have to be honest with you, I don't enjoy gardening. I like the metaphor, but I'm not a gardener. But I love that topic, and I love the comparison of God as a master gardener, and we're going to go into that a little bit deeper in a moment. But I would love for you to share a little bit about you and your family and your ministry and where you're at today.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. And I am a mama of 3 girls. So we're just kicking off a new school year here in a couple of weeks. And I have a high schooler for the first time. My oldest daughter is a freshman, and then my middle daughter is 6th grade. So first time in middle school for her. And my youngest is a 3rd grader. And I am a foodie. I love all things food, cooking, and eating. And I also love to run. I feel privileged to live here in Central California because we have beautiful trails and lots of different terrains, whether that's, oceans a few hours away, mountains, or even right here in my own backyard, just kind of some beautiful trails that go along the foothills. And I'm an author and a speaker. So my job in this season of life, besides mothering, is speaking to women's groups, teaching the Bible, and writing books.
Are you having to homeschool these grades right now, the high school and middle school?
You know what? I'm going to call it distance learning because I don't want to be fully responsible for homeschooling. I certainly don't have the bandwidth for that right now, but my kids attend a Christian school, so we will be starting online, and thankfully they do all the work of curriculum and setting us up with what we need, and they'll be online with their teachers for, several hours a day.
Wow, that's a lot. So we're going to do some fun facts before we get into our talk today. And so you mentioned you're a runner, and I'm a runner as well. So I'm curious, what is your energy boost of choice when you're running? And then what is the worst food that you've had after a marathon or after an event?
Okay, such a fun question. Well, my energy that I use, or my, as we call it, nutrition for runners. If I'm going to do a long run, or if I'm, running a half marathon or a marathon, I love honey stinger chews. And they're kind of like the consistency of a gummy bear for people who maybe aren't runners, but they provide a little bit of energy. They use honey instead of some of the other nutrition, which tends to have more of like a sugar blast, and those for some reason upset my stomach. So I swear by the honey stinger chews.
I
And
have not
then,
had those.
oh, you also asked about
Yeah.
the worst food, and I had to really think about this one because honestly, after I've done races, I'm usually ravenous, and everything seems like it's amazing. But one thing I could think of is I remember I did this trail race, the San Joaquin River Trail, and they had burritos with chorizo afterwards, and it was just really greasy. I normally like sausage and chorizo, but there was just something about after that race downing that, and my stomach was not happy with me. So that was kind of a worst thing that I ate after a race. And as far as a beverage, I have a funny story that one time when I was running, I ran the Chicago Marathon, and I was so depleted and so thirsty after that race. And the only thing cold that they had at the finish line was an ice cold beer, which some people maybe would enjoy, but is not something I would normally drink. And I was standing there with this ice cold beer, and my husband comes up to me and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "I just needed the ice." So he poured out the beer, he put the ice in a cup of water for me, and it was gold. But it was a pretty funny moment because I was a little bit out of sorts and he hardly recognized me.
What happened to you on that run? You're drinking beer now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that always, I've seen that at a couple races, and I'm not interested in that either. And one race that I did, their stations along the way, they had marshmallows.
Oh, yeah, I have seen marshmallows before. Doesn't
Yeah,
seem like something I could get down
I, and
while running.
yeah, I wouldn't want to have that in my mouth as I ran. One question that I ask everyone I talk to is when you look back in your life, how far back can you go to see the very purpose that you are living out today and who you've always been?
What a good question. I was thinking about how from the time I was a very young girl, I can remember in first grade how much I loved to write. And I was a creative writer. I wrote a story back in first grade that I often talk about when I speak in the schools. It was about these two unicorns who fell in love. And that was before unicorns were as trendy as they were now. But it was during that time as a young person that I think God really knit into my soul that he wanted me to be a storyteller. And really the way that I came to Christian faith is because I was so enthralled with the Bible and the stories that I heard in Sunday school and other places, my parents just unpacking them for me at home. So as I look back on my life, I've done a lot of different types of writing and different types of communicating. But I believe that that purpose, that seed was planted in me from the time I was young. I mean, first grade is what, 6 or 7 years old. And along the way, God has continued to just foster and cultivate that idea for me that my purpose is to be a creative communicator and to lead people back to his glory.
I love that. Thank you. It's so fun when, yeah, same thing when you look back at your childhood and I'll look through pictures and I'll be like, wow, I did that when I was 3 even.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really cool. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that you wrote a book called Flourishing Together,
Yes.
and that you correlate and use the metaphor as God as the master gardener. I like that you bring to light that he likes us to focus on abiding, more abiding, less producing. And it just seems like we're in this world right now where we're constantly wanting to produce. But I loved the correlation of letting him prune us, letting him cultivate us so that we can flourish, but not only that, so that we can help others flourish. And you share that concept of flourishing and cultivating has helped you even move forward in your marriage. And I was wondering if you share a little bit of that story with us.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite metaphors that's used all throughout the Bible. And I have to admit, I'm not a master gardener in any way. I'm kind of good at killing plants.
Me
I
too.
have a friend who is amazing with succulents, and she always teases me because I just tend to buy new succulents from her that she's arranged every season because I've killed some in the past. But I love how God just continues to use Jesus, especially in his ministry, uses these stories and these metaphors that have to do with agriculture and growth and flourishing. And so for me, this really came alive in my life. Just to give a little bit of context and backstory, I got married back in 2003 to a wonderful man named Eric Lee Gilmore. I met him on a mission trip to Haiti, and he and I, we were both track coaches, so we got to coach track and field together, and we ended up having 3 daughters, as I mentioned in the beginning, that I have 3 girls. And we also, because we had met on that mission trip, I kind of knew that Haiti was going to be a part of our story. His grandparents actually were pioneer missionaries in Haiti in the 1940s. So it was really like a part of his family legacy and history. And so when we got married, then we started a nonprofit organization that kind of continued his grandparents' ministry, just empowering Haitians. And my role in that was that I started a fair trade jewelry business. So again, something I never really planned on, but I always loved making jewelry when I was a young person and through college. And as that role kind of, came into more flourishing, just leading this group of artists and women who made jewelry there in the northern mountains of Haiti. And then part of what I would do is come back to the US to sell their jewelry and to tell their stories. So again, that storytelling thread was there. Those seeds were being cultivated. And Eric Lee and I, we worked together in that ministry for almost a decade. And in 2014, he was actually diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma cancer. And it was just like a sucker punch to the gut for us. He was a really healthy guy, an athlete, a nutrition teacher. We had so much planned that year in terms of trips to Haiti and things with our jewelry company. And obviously we had 3 kids at the time. So my daughters were 2, 5, and 8, their ages. And so when we received that diagnosis in May of that year, it was devastating, and everything in our lives just came to this screeching halt. I didn't really have any experience with cancer or someone in my family having cancer. And so it was being launched into treatments and caregiving for him and focusing on that. And just to make kind of a long and hard story short, he actually went to heaven in September of that year. So it was a pretty quick battle with cancer by most standards, although it felt pretty excruciatingly long for me to see him suffer even through those summer months. And, as you can imagine, I was 37 at that time. I had 3 young kids. I was teaching at the university, and I was trying to run this fair trade jewelry business. There was just so much, and I had never imagined this being a part of my story. But through that time, then God really began to work in me through my grief journey. I actually stepped down from the ministry in Haiti and from the jewelry project. I was able to kind of pass the baton to some other people that were leaders in our ministry. And I really focused in that season on grieving and taking a break, resting. I mean, I hadn't rested probably for a decade with dealing with a nonprofit. And I just felt like the Holy Spirit was pressing on me that this was a time where I needed to nourish well, to give myself space for that. And then also for my kids, that I could be present for them, not flying to different countries and dealing with all of the stuff I had before. So that was sort of the beginning of what I might call my flourishing journey. And a lot of times in the beginning, like if we think about the pruning stage, I mean, you prune roses, you've got to hack those babies down to the stem if you want to see flourishing in the future. And so in a lot of ways, I felt like that. I felt like my ministry had been pruned. Obviously, my husband, who I loved, he was gone, and the future dreams that I had to be pulled back in a lot of ways. But that's where that metaphor really came alive for me. And I see how God just began during that time to prune and cultivate me.
Wow, that is so good. Thank you. So now you have a new book that's coming out, and you've also written a couple children's book, but the one that's coming out when this is posting will be a week later, so it'll be out next week. It's called Walk, Run, Soar, and that grabbed my attention because I do love to run, but before I started running, I was an avid speed walker.
Okay.
And so I never had interest in running. In fact, some of my friends still don't like me when I walk because they still have to run to keep up my walk pace. But a friend had asked me to come out and be her pacer on her walk days while she was training for a full marathon. And so I went out to do that, and she just said, "Oh, forget it. You might as well run." And then she dared me to run, and that, if you dare me, then I guess that's all over. So I signed up. I had never run before, and this was June, and I signed up to run a full in November.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so she said, even if you end up walking it with your pace, you're still going to do fine, and you're going to love it. And so I did run my full, one full, but I love halves. I love them so much. And so,
Me too.
But now I'm back to walking more than running because I am recovering from an ACL surgery. But how long have you been running? How did you get started, and what's the history in your running?
I started running when I was a young person. I was a soccer player since I was, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5. I got started playing soccer, and then my dad actually invited me to train for a race with him. I think it might have been a 5K or a 10K. I grew up in the south side of Chicago, and so it was just one of those runs that went through the neighborhood. It was famous in our area, and that was sort of the beginning of my running. And frankly, I did it because I knew I could already run because of being a soccer player, and I just wanted to spend time with my dad. So it was just this quality time that I could get with him. And then I ended up playing sports through elementary school, did softball and soccer and some things. We didn't have track and field at our elementary school, but in high school, I wanted to play soccer, and I went to a small private school where my mom taught, but they didn't have a girls team. And so in a conversation that we had with the coach of the guys team, he said, "Well, I would love to have you on my boys team if you would be willing to run track and field for me." I was like, "Oh, wow. Okay, sure." I mean, what's track and field? It's just running, right? I didn't really know that much about track and field as a sport, but I thought, oh, this is a great way to stay in shape for soccer. And, obviously made this little deal with him that he would allow me to be on the boys team for high school. So long story short is I fell in love with track and field. It was just a wonderful sport. I ended up becoming a middle distance runner and a hurdler, and loved competing, still played soccer. And then it was probably after college that I got a little bit more into distance running. I would say the 10K and the half marathon are kind of sweet spots for me. I've done a couple of marathons, but yeah, I enjoy the half marathon the most. Yeah. And it's something definitely significant to train for, but it doesn't require, so many hours of training during the week. And being a mama and a writer, yeah, it's good to have some time that I can work on some other things. So
absolutely. I like the halves. So you have written this book with your current husband, Shawn, and I have a question about the current book that you wrote with him, but give us a little bit about how you met Shawn.
Yeah, well, this is sort of chapter 2 of the story. And actually my Flourishing Together Bible study, which we've already been talking about, was written after I married Shawn. So Shawn was actually one of the teammates who was also on the original mission team that I went, that mission trip with Eric Lee. And Eric Lee and Shawn had been good friends through church, kind of in their college days. They both were runners, and so they had connected through church. And Eric Lee invited Shawn to come on the mission trip. So all of us got to know each other pretty well through that. In fact, there was 8 of us that became very tight friends through that. And then Shawn was just a part of our lives. He was our single guy friend through the years. He supported our ministry. You know, he lived in Maryland for about 8 years while we were working in Haiti. So he was on our prayer list and supported us financially. And whenever he'd come out to California, where his family was from, he would come and visit us. We would, you know, make dinner for him, or he'd come stay at our house. So through the years, we had built just such a sweet friendship with him. And honestly, for all those years that Eric Lee and I were married, more than 11 years, we had prayed for Shawn and his future wife. And it was something that my husband, Eric Lee, had really on his heart, so heavy that God was preparing someone for his buddy Shawn. So crazy that I would actually be praying for myself. And so God brought Shawn back into my life after Eric Lee's death. He actually had flown out for the funeral and was helping me through that. And just in that following year, he ended up moving back to California. His mom was a widow and he was caring for his mom. And so, you know, of course, I can see now that God was orchestrating all these details, but it wasn't like he moved back for me. And we just got to develop our friendship, and God just brought this wild and crazy story. But he already knew my kids. My family embraced him already as a dear friend of ours. My mother-in-law, Eric Lee's mom, had always called him her adopted son. And so every piece of it just fit. It was like God had already carved out that puzzle piece, and he was just placing it right where it belongs. So that's kind of the story of Shawn and me coming together. So we've been married for 4 years. And my girls have a new daddy who loves them dearly. And then Shawn and I started working on this book project together because we're both runners. He has always kind of dreamed of writing a book. So I wrote the bulk of the book. It's a devotional. So it includes kind of inspirational stories from my running and our coaching together. And then he came behind and did a lot of the editing and included some coaching tips for the runners who might read the book.
It's a great outline. I really like the outline. And I know there's people listening that would probably say, well, I'm not a runner, or there's some that physically can't run. But I think there's great ways to use this book for general training, even if it is like walking, like you say, run, walk, soar. But so how would you say to use this book to motivate new fitness goals or strengthen their faith? And how are those two connected?
That's a really good question. You know, kind of the outline of the book, as you mentioned, it's 52 weeks, and each chapter or section for those weeks of the year, it includes some different elements. So there's a scripture at the beginning, and then there's more of a story-driven devotional, as I mentioned. And then we also include a faith step, which is usually a question or an action step that people can take in their own faith lives. And we have some journaling space so people can jot down ideas and reflections. And then Shawn actually did the coaching tips, as I mentioned. So really we're trying to take people on this weekly journey. And as you know, from training for long distance races, you have to go through kind of a training program. If you're going to run a half marathon, you don't start day one and run 13 miles. You have to build up to it. You have to do probably some strength training. You have to pay attention to what you're eating a little bit, and definitely your sleep, all of those elements. And so this book, it's a devotional, but really I think it's kind of guiding people through that process in a physical sense, if they want to set a fitness goal, but also in a spiritual sense, that if we want to really, you know, strengthen our muscles, so to speak, in a spiritual way, that we have to spend time in God's word. I have some suggestions in the appendix of the book about memorizing scripture and just making that sort of a part of your routine. And then I think reflection is so important. I used to journal every day. I don't do it quite as often as I used to, but just even having a little bit of time where you could jot down a list of things that you're thankful for, or a couple of lines of ways that you saw God being faithful in a week, that can just also be such an important part of us maturing in our faith. And so that's kind of what we're bringing people on this journey. There's an intersection for us of faith and running. And even if you're not a runner, it could be for walking, it could be for exercise. And obviously the Bible just is brimming with stories that are related to athletes and running a lot. The Apostle Paul, a lot. I'm convinced that he was a marathoner because he talks about it a lot in his letters. Just having perseverance and running the race, all of those things.
Absolutely. I'm with you 100% on that. That's even, the name of my podcast, Your Spiritual Game Plan, started from, working with my daughter's basketball back 15 years ago and thinking, our kids have all these game plays and they know their plays, they know where they're going, but then we don't do that with our spiritual life. And having a spiritual game plan, an offense and a defense and all that stuff. And I work with youth on coming up with one. So I love how the Bible works on that. So I was looking at this new book, Walk, Run, Soar, and there's a kind of a little bit of a theme in the flourishing together, and that is cultivating.
Yeah.
But you, in your first chapter of this book, you talk about cultivating courage. And that is one of the biggest things that's so hard. I ask people if they want to come run with us. We have a pretty big group of women that run now, and they meet every Sunday as a group. And there's people at all different paces, at all different levels. And there's like a 3 mile, a 5 mile, and a 7 mile option. And so many people are so overwhelmed with even thinking of getting started. They don't even have the courage. So what would you say to someone that really wants to start moving, start exercising, but they think they need to cultivate that courage to get started?
Cultivate is one of my favorite words. And as you can tell, it kind of has that crossover between the Flourishing book and then this new Walk, Run, Soar book. But that the word cultivate, it means to develop or to train. And if you think about it in the gardening sense, we have to cultivate the soil. You have to break up the hard soil. We have to water it. Sometimes we have to add extra, plant food or some kind of nourishment to make that soil rich. Some people do the composting to make sure that it works well for whatever plants they're going to put in there, the types of seeds that they're going to put in there. And I think about it similarly with running, that we have these goals, but we have to train. We have to build up to it. And kind of how I talked about before, we have to even mentally prepare ourselves if we're going to run a half marathon, or, we're going to face some other trial that comes our way, like my husband's cancer journey. So I think my encouragement to people would be that, we need to start out slow, and that's how you train. That's how you grow a plant. You have to kind of get the soil ready, and you have to set out, okay, what am I going to do? And I remember the first time that I ran or I trained for a marathon, Eric Lee made a training plan for me. And in those first few weeks, I was running a couple miles here, a couple miles there. I was starting out pretty slow, and then we would build upon that. And in the beginning, I thought, there is no way I'm going to run 26 miles. I mean, just a couple of miles felt taxing. And I'm a sprinter. I mentioned before that I'm a track athlete. And so I get great joy from running fast. And unless you're real elite, you're not running fast in the marathon. So I had to train my body in a whole different way. And so I think for people who are just starting out and want to cultivate that courage, it's about taking the first step. It's about being consistent and getting out there and following a training plan, not letting yourself off the hook, unless you have an injury or something, that's different. But really, training yourself in consistency. And honestly, some of my hardest training days for that marathon, I remember one day that I went out and I had to run like 12 miles or something, and it was so hot in Fresno, and it was on me because I hadn't got up early enough that day to get out when it was cooler. So I ended up running those miles in real heat and kind of overheating. And it was not a good choice, but it was a lesson that I remembered. And I cultivated so much perseverance, even in that one workout, that when I was in the marathon, later running 26 miles, I could call up that day in my mind and remember how I survived that? Remember how I got through that? Like, I can take the next step. So that would be kind of my coaching advice to anyone starting out. My husband, Shawn, and I, we do train people every year to run half marathons and marathons. And that's kind of some of the advice that we give them.
That's perfect advice. It's great. My first full, my only full, I I actually did not even listen to music. I asked everyone, well, I asked people to give me their prayer requests,
Mm.
and I collected 26, and I gave each one a mile. And I put little things to remember which person got which mile based on either their age or their birth year, or like with my kids, I gave them the mile of their age.
Uh-huh.
And so mile 6, if my son was 6, I prayed for him. And
Love
it really helped me focus on other things, because that was the Seattle full marathon 2006. That was my first and only marathon, and it's still known as the worst weather in the history of the Seattle Marathon. So but as you mentioned in your book, I love how you say running helps you experience God's presence, his purpose, and his glory in a deeper way. And it reminded me that while I was praying and running and feeling the rhythm, I just felt so connected to God. And so how has that been for you?
Yeah, running has been that place that really has always been just rejuvenating for me, and a place where I've been able to connect with God. I sometimes call running my therapy. Now, don't get me wrong, I do believe in actual therapy and
Yes.
in seeing a counselor for various things in life, and I think that's really important. So I don't want to downplay that in any way. But I know that in my grief journey, that the times that I spent running, and I really started trail running after my husband's death. Before that, I was more of a road racer or road runner. But I joined a group of other moms, and we started to explore some of the mountain trails just in our area. And I fell in love with it because I got to go out, and I wasn't trying to, break records or win medals or be on podiums. I was really just out there to have a little bit of time to myself. And as a mom of 3 girls who were very young, it was that place where I could just process with the Lord, where I could pray. Sometimes I would cry. Sometimes my sweat was my tears as I was grieving. And I had some really sweet friends who just went through and gave me the ministry of presence. They were present with me during those hard days and just running together and processing together. And so running then started to shift. It wasn't a place of competition necessarily, even though I loved that when I was younger. It wasn't a place of so much pushing as hard as I could, but it was really a place where I started to realize, wow, this is God's glory. He's showing me these mountains and these hills and these rainbow sherbet skies, and even the sound of the water when we had run along the river or we were near a lake. So much of that was calming to my spirit. And so that's why I say I experienced his presence there through creation, even just kind of having that processing time. And it was a stress relief for me. And even more in recent years, I think running has become kind of a prayer practice for me. So I'll go out for a run, and it's kind of just my time that I get to pray. I might not always have that sort of uninterrupted time at home with my girls, who would come in. So if I know I can go out for a run for an hour and just talk to God about whatever is stressing me out or the chaos that is swirling in our world, it's just been something very sweet.
Yeah, that has been so true for me as well. My girlfriends and I call it pavement therapy. We say, they'll even say that, what day this week can we get some pavement therapy in? And
Yeah.
it's just such a time. But even going alone is just that time to really hear his voice and pray. And so one of the chapters in the book that I liked was on coaching.
Mm-hmm.
And, you have to really trust your coach. And watching even with my kids in their basketball, their game really kind of was determined by their relationship with the coach, and if they enjoyed him or if they trusted what he was telling them to do. And now with me, and I'm recovering from ACL replacement, I have to really listen to my physical therapist, who is also a runner. And so he's telling me this is how you can do it, and this is the best way to go. And there's times I just want to push my pace, but I know I can't. And I think so many times we can correlate that with trusting God. as our coach, and he wants us to have endurance. He wants us to do the long haul with him. And, but yet I'm wanting to achieve things right now. And so how have you found that in your own journey?
You know what? I have a few different devotionals in the book that are about coaching and trusting your coach and trusting God as your pacer. And I think that's such a powerful metaphor. I've had some wonderful coaches in my life, and in a running sense, running coaches, different types of coaches too, but I've had some great running coaches. I had an awesome Christian track and field coach in high school who I really had to trust because I didn't know very much about the sport. And I was just learning about my body and what I could handle as a high school girl. And he really just had a great sense of how he could push me, but he also encouraged me. He would write out little scriptures on pieces of paper, and then he'd have me go run laps or go run the fields or whatever and try to memorize scripture. And so he was kind of training me in a spiritual sense as well as a physical sense. His name was Tony Churchill. But then both of my husbands, Eric Lee and Shawn, have been my running coaches. And, you know, one thing about Shawn that I love is he's not the type of coach who is like, you know, military screaming in your ear, telling you what to do. He's more of a quiet coach, but he often will position himself kind of right in front of me if we're going to run, and he'll just like pace me and he'll have me follow. And if there's certain days where maybe I'm dealing with an injury or there's some external circumstance, like right now we've got lots of smoke in California because we have all these forest fires going on, I always have a discussion with Shawn about what should I do, you know, how much should I go today? And I really trust him. I know that he has my best interest in mind. I know that he's not going to push me too far, but I know that he also, you know, is going to challenge me. And I think that's so true with God, that we have to keep in mind that God always has our best interest in mind. And so sometimes we want to do things our own way, or we kind of how you were talking about, we want to push because we want to achieve something, or we want to finish something, or maybe we want to pursue a relationship or a conversation. But we have to listen to the Holy Spirit's voice and just trusting that he's our coach. And he sometimes makes us wait. He makes us pull back in our training, maybe because of injuries. And then there's other days where he's going to push us to run our guts out, and he's going to give us the strength to get there. So I love just that correlation between God being our coach and just being reminded that we can trust him because he has our best interest in mind.
I love that. Thank you so much. Before we close, like I mentioned earlier, your book will be coming out next week, and you're going to be having a launch party, and that's going to be on Facebook, right?
Yes, it'll be probably on Facebook Live and Instagram Live. So if anyone has a preference there.
Yeah, and those links to join that launch party will be in the show notes and in the blog for today. So you can go on there. And what are you guys going to be doing for the party? Do you know yet?
Well, we would love to have people join us. It'll probably be about an hour long, but we're going to read from the book a little bit. My husband, Shawn, and I are going to talk about some of the behind the scenes of putting it together. We're going to have some fun giveaways for people that show up. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the race that we're hosting. It's called the Walk Run Soar virtual run. And so that's another thing that people can participate in. That's really kind of our launch party, is to do this run later in October. So we'll have more details about that.
And you get a medal for that?
It's a virtual run. So you get a race bib, you get a medal, you get a little gaiter, which is one of those kind of neck things that you can use as a mask.
Oh, yeah.
And you get a copy of the book as well.
Wow.
So people can sign up for that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day and blessing our listeners. And we look forward to reading your book and going to your launch party.
Thanks so much, Cheri. It's been a blessing.
I hope that you enjoyed my time with Dorina. The book Walk, Run, Soar will be out September 29th of this year, and all links to the launch party and the virtual run will be in the show notes. As someone who enjoys running, I appreciate the holistic approach that Dorina and her husband Shawn combine to fitness and faith. Just like cultivating soil is necessary to grow plants and vegetables, fitness helps us cultivate our mind and our body to do His work and to run the race. I like how Dorina reminded us that we need to let God be our pacer in training, in the race, and in life. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any others. I would also appreciate it if you would give this podcast a rating and leave a review. If you've missed the other episodes, please go back and take a listen. I know the guests will bless you. I would love to connect with you, and the ways to contact me are also in the show notes.